So, welcome everybody to the show. It's great to have you all here, and let's dive in. This is our first panel, and I'm excited topic of cybersecurity culture with you all. So, what is culture? What is cybersecurity culture? Does HR own culture?
It sounded like three questions, but yeah, we'll take it as one if he's sneaking it in there. I'll start just because the first subset of your first question was what is culture. And I think this is a little bit misunderstood. I think it's become, I think, the idea of culture as something you can create or force or shape, are all worthy thought exercises and things that you can make progress on. But ultimately, culture, by definition, is created through shared experience and shared understanding, and shared belief. And so in that you have a much more complicated tapestry when you start to talk about cyber culture, because there's culture that's already there before the cybersecurity requirements showed up. And there's culture being bred and culture developing and strengthening in and away from the regulatory compliance efforts and the experiences that you're trying to, try to have your employees share with one another around cybersecurity. So you can influence culture towards behaviors that are more in line with what you want out of cybersecurity. But a lot of the conversations that I think we've been having are around the idea that you can't just sort of define what cyber culture is and then drop it into an organization, because without taking a baseline and really understanding the culture that's already there, because you're not going to replace it. You might change it a little bit, but you're not going to replace it.
And I think there is, Chris, to that point, there is, not necessarily a trend that we've seen, but something that every time it kind of, the specter of this crosses our path, you and I both kind of bristle a little bit at it, which is reducing culture to a score. I don't think you can get a 7 out of 10 on culture. It's too complicated. It's too unique to your organization. It changes. It has a historical precedent, depending on how many bridges were burned by the CISO before you, let's just say, or how an organization has grown and changed over time. So all those stories, all those symbols, all that lore, all the things that make your culture what it is, plus the people and their values that they bring to the table, isn't a 7 out of 10. And I think while we're always looking for new metrics to bring to our organization to show our progress in cybersecurity, safety, or culture, or how as an infosec team we are doing better at getting our people to be sort of a cyber defense agent for the organization. You can't turn it into a 7 out of 10 score. So I just caution people to back away from a simple number to define this. It's something you're going to have to stick your teeth into, and sometimes it's ugly and sometimes it's better than you think it is. But as Chris said, you don't know until you actually get in there and you look.
You guys both make tremendously interesting points, and I feel many of my clients that I work with, the CEOs always ask the same question, or they all have the same request, and that is, we need help driving culture. We need help creating culture. We need help, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. You can't create. This isn't something that you all of a sudden wake up one day and say, I want our culture to be this, and that's what happens. Strictly from an HR perspective, the culture is driven by the population, and it comes from the top down. It's behavior. It's what we're exposed to. It's working with one another. It's organic. It's something that happens on its own. It's not something you could force to happen. And I feel like in many cases, especially with companies that are in huge growth periods, there's this fear that we're going to lose the special sauce. We're going to lose the culture building aspect. We're going to lose what made us so special. And a lot of times HR is asked to step in and say, help keep that. What do we do? And I feel like a large part of what I do from an HR perspective is kind of just listening to the masses, understanding what got them to that point, and figuring out a way to make that work as like a 2.0 version. as they continue to scale and grow and move away from, maybe a 6-person core team that made them so special to begin with, but how to capture that and keep it moving. So it's my take on culture anyway.
And just to
I would
kind of
love to work with you
summarize
if
what
you
I
were,
heard, so
oh, sorry.
sorry. No, I was just saying, if I would summarize what I heard, you're basically saying first step would be do an assessment just like you would, on any cyber program, do an assessment of the culture, see where you are, and then perhaps even kind of reassess your culture, I don't know, once a year or however, I guess you would know best, but that's just what I took away.
Yeah, and Brendon, to your point, that's exactly right, which is, I think we like to ask the question first, well, who are your people? Mm-hmm. Like, we want to protect our people. Great. Who are they? What motivates them? What inspires them? What movies do they like? Do you know anything about them? If you've got 45,000 of them, that's a lot. You're probably going to have some tribes in there that you're going to need to identify and look at. If it's a 10-person company, you can do it probably a lot quicker, but we assume we know how to train. We assume we know how to communicate with people. We assume all these things. And when you take that assumption out and you say, actually get some data, who are your people? What are their values? What is their belief system? How do they want to operate in the workplace? What do they think about some of these rules and restrictions, let's say, for instance, that we happen to put upon them in terms of regulatory training or whatnot? You don't know unless you actually go out, ask, and get the data. And Cybermaniacs does do this. We have an assessment that we look at holistically across the organization, because that's what we're trying to find out is who are the people and what do they actually think, feel, and believe about security and security culture at your organization today. But to your other point, Brendon, is a lot of people look at this measurement as a once and done exercise or a ginormous survey they can send out for 20 minutes and then thank goodness they're done. And I think that, just like microlearning has revolutionized how we do L&D, you have to be getting the temperature of your organization or take a litmus test on all these people all the time. So it can be done in smaller, bite-sized formats. You just have to start looking at what those measurement tools are and how you best implement them into your organization.
And I think it's important also. So no, you can't reduce culture down to a single score of 7 out of 10. But there are decades and decades of research on how to characterize culture in the place, in the workplace, and in organizations. And so there is absolutely track to run on to begin to characterize those tribes that Kate was talking about. So that in an organization, even of several hundred, you're going to find pockets of culture which actually exists and influences people's behaviors in those pockets differently than another subculture or another sort of area of the organization. The thought process, shared experience is going to drive behavior and decision making in a slightly different way. So those differences are absolutely measurable, and you can characterize them. It's just a much more complicated score. And then on top of that, it's more complicated in terms of, well, how do you influence it? So back to Angelo's point, how do you actually then drive the influences and the patterns that you're seeing in the culture and the behavior in those pockets amongst those tribes? And then how do you address those cultural patterns in a way that gets you farther down the track of what you wanted, either preserving the culture, because actually this group over here, they completely exemplify what we really think we want to be about and who we are, or in fact actually we need to shift the culture over here. And every cultural pattern is going to have triggers for change. It's going to have triggers for resistance, but they're not going to be the same. So one tribe over here that's exhibiting one type of culture that's characterized in a particular way will have specific types of activities, specific ways that present material, which they'll respond better to than if you took the same tactics and applied it to a separate subculture in your organization. So that baseline that Kate's also talking about, where you're sort of constantly trying to keep the pulse on that, begins to collect that picture. It's a mosaic in your organization of all those little cultural trends and patterns and influences, which gives you the best shot of then tailoring any program for actually trying to have an influence.
And Angelo, you were talking a bit about HR's involvement. So I know the second or third part of that question was, does HR own culture? So I don't know if you want to speak to that for a minute or two.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like most executives feel HR does own it. And there is no owning culture. I mean, there are certainly drivers. There are certainly groups that will help push things, change things, implement change. I think HR is a driver in that. But I don't think that we are the creator of culture, or we are all culture knowing. I think that's a little bit of that continues to, I think, be one of the challenges that HR executives face. I've faced it in large corporations of 30,000 people. I've faced it in small groups of 12 people. Many times when CEOs or executives are asking about culture, it's because there's a concern. There's almost like it's a panic. It's after the fact. I'm like, okay, well, we probably should have been having this conversation about a year ago, but we're here, so let's address it. And it's very much like HR step in and fix it. I'm like, well, we can't be the fixer here, but what we can do is kind of unearth where the issues or the challenges are and help get us to whatever that next step is in our culture building process. Whether it's, again, we talked a lot about, and I heard Chris, you mentioned as well, and Kate as well, it's really important, I think, for a company to have set already overarching goals and behaviors and all of those things that you see maybe some posters up on the wall talking about behaviors or things that the companies want to do or defining who we are. And I think the more sensitivity and the more pointed ideas you have around those very topics, I think it makes it easier for people in the HR world to step in and really help kind of get that messaging across. If we stand for something, if there is a mission statement, what are our values as an organization? And again, this changes by group, because within any corporate culture, you have a tech culture, you may have an editorial culture if you're working in people that are writers, and what drives them are very different things. And the way you communicate with them, you communicate with them all very differently as well. But I think if you have overarching goals and behaviors that are in line with kind of your company or your brand DNA, it's going to help you as it relates to setting culture or working through culture, or what does culture look like for us. But I do feel like a lot of this falls on HR's shoulders. It is our responsibility to kind of step in and figure out why and what and how do we, what are we doing here? We need you to help kind of shepherd this. And I feel like the only way that truly will be effective is if HR is intimately involved with all of the business aspects. You really have to be part of the groups and understand what they do. And if that means sitting in on multiple meetings across different disciplines to understand what drives them and how their group works and what helps them operate, HR has to do that. They have to make the investment to do that. So when we talk about culture, we could talk so in a holistic and more full-bodied way, because we know, we've seen how the sausage is made. We're sitting in on these meetings. We are interested in what you're doing. Oh, that's why that means something to you. We get it now. But without that, you're going to have kind of a thrown together process that won't be truly connected. So in a roundabout way of answering that, HR is absolutely a huge component or part of driving that. But I think there needs to be a lot of legwork that goes in behind the scenes before it works at all.
And a follow-up to that, I would say, is how can culture act as a barrier or a protector of an organization?
I think there are many organizations out there that have tribes or a cult-like following, I want to say, with their internal staff, and I mean I mean that term or that phrase in the best way possible. I remember being an active recruiter and looking for talent to build pipeline or constantly networking. There are those companies out there that are like the holy grails, I feel like, of individuals, and when you call on them, they're like, not interested, love where I am, love the team, and it happens often. And I feel like some of it may have to do with their position. They love what they do, they love their boss, but in most instances, it's because the organizations they're working for have created this kind of harmonious, fantastic environment that resonates with them, and they're not looking for another opportunity because they're happy where they are. And I feel like from an HR perspective, I'm always interested in kind of finding out what those nuances are, like what makes the culture so special. I remember in New York City when Bloomberg was building their new tower and everyone wanted to work at Bloomberg because it was this like really cool environment, and it was like free lunches and free this, and we have a gym on site, and we have, you can bring your child to work and your dog, and we have, like, it was just offering after offering after offering. And I thought, well, I want to work at Bloomberg. This sounds fun. Like, just to see what it was all about. And I feel like because of that, whether it was a gimmick or, this was the hot trend at the moment, they developed this like ironclad, following of individuals that created a culture of, you want to work here and this is why. And if you work here, you're definitely one of the cool kids. Before that, it was, companies like back in the .com days, I think of Star Media, and it's all these very cool companies. Diageo was another one where once you're in, you're in. And I feel like in order to do that, number one, you have to have the tools to back it up, and you have to have the infrastructure to say, this is what makes us special. It can't just be a smoke and mirror thing. But you also have to have an HR team as well as any other leadership team helping to drive that and maintain that by continuing to build on it and saying, oh, this is what we offered when we first started, but 6 months from now, this is going to be what's happening, kind of to be ahead of that trend, to keep kind of your arms around that group in a tight way. I think has a lot to do with it. And when I go out to look for talent or call on individuals or a certain company, it's like, oh, this person's at, such and such a company. And I'm like, they're never going to leave. I know it already because I know the culture. I know what gets them to stay there. Maybe it's, they pay competitively. Certainly that's table stakes, but it's the other things that make them, not want to look elsewhere.
And I think to follow on to what Angelo was saying, the question around insofar as a cybersecurity culture, and is that protecting your organization or is it a barrier, right? When Angelo said earlier, like a lot of times he only gets called when something goes wrong. The same sort of thing applies. Like we only seem to notice when culture is the friction. We only seem to notice, we try to roll out a policy, we try to do a new data protection thing, and everyone's like, not paying attention. We're like, why didn't that happen? And I'm like, it's probably the culture, right? And it's funny because I think Cisco did some research a few years ago, where they pulled CISOs on, what were the barriers or what were some of the obstacles that were involved with adopting not just security practice, but like advanced, very mature security practices. And culture came in like the top 5 of things, more than just lack of trained personnel, more than budget constraints, more than competing priorities. There is an organizational culture and an attitude around cybersecurity that was acting as a continual barrier to their progress. So that's where I can say the research has even shown that it can be a barrier to your implementation. And I think, in the days of agile implementation, we've definitely seen that. So there's different, there's lots of different organizational anthropology research, which I'll let Chris kind of get into because that's his forte, that have shown over time that it can act as a barrier. But at the same time, if you look at things like, there was research that was just published on Glassdoor, right? Where organizations with a poor culture were 3 times more likely to be breached than those with a good culture ranking. Now that's not cybersecurity culture, that's just general culture overall, but I think it has to go to that feeling or ethos that Angelo was talking about, which is, this is why we want to be here. Because we love this company, we want to protect it. And I think the two really do go hand in hand.
Yeah, I mean, Oh, sorry, Angelo.
No, go right ahead. I was going to say absolutely, Kate. It's spot on.
Can I get an amen? So so one of the ways that it can either be a barrier or be very supportive of change, any sort of change initiative, is it's helpful to think about culture as a living, breathing thing. And when you think about, you hear people talking about, oh, well, this is the company's DNA. or this has been in our corporate culture for, for decades, right? And there's a real identity, there's a way of doing things. Again, there's a really, a really strong, pronounced culture. What we're actually saying is that culture is existing irrespective of the individuals that are moving in and out of it, right? So you can think of the culture as pernicious. It is a pattern that actually brings people into its influence, and it will support and reward people who further the culture, and it will punish and diminish people who actually try to break that culture up, which is how cultural patterns, once set in motion, irrespective of people, individuals or groups trying to change it, sometimes it's really, really difficult and sticky. It's because these patterns already have mechanisms, subconscious mechanisms, that are set up to perpetuate themselves through individuals. And so in that, again, you will naturally have, depending on how any change program or compliance program is presented, culture will kind of decide whether or not it's a threat or whether it's, supportive. And we'll actually react to it in that way through individuals who decide, oh, this is terrible, it's never going to work, and I don't want to participate, or wow, this is, of course we're going to do this. And again, I think that characterizing that culture, or characterizing what's in play, particularly if it's strong, and especially if it's positive, and really beginning to understand those characteristics will then give you clues as to how you can go about the process of designing a compliance or a change program which avoids the types of resistance points that are built into that culture, and might help you tap into some of the natural triggers that enable change in those patterns that do exist, but they're different from culture to culture. So a lot of it is just that familiarity, right? Every culture can be shaped and can be, to a certain extent, can be shaped and can be influenced, but you have to understand it first. It's just like, it's like a relationship, right? You can't just go in without knowing a person and hope to have the type of influence and positive change impact in their lives that you're hoping to until you get to know them.
And I do feel that cybersecurity as a function or as a market right now is looking for a silver bullet in culture, because this is sort of the next level of maturity, and it was part of the RSA topic over the last couple of years. And I feel like almost every cybersecurity awareness company is like, use our training to improve your cybersecurity culture. And I actually disagree with that fundamentally, because I don't think that a slide deck is going to change your culture. As Chris said, if it's strong and positive, you can use it as the wind in your sails. If it's something negative that needs to be changed, it can be especially pernicious. And this is the legend. You go look at Forbes magazine, you go look at TED Talks, whatever, you will see time after time CEOs being like, well, I tried to come in and like revamp the whole organization, and then you like nosedive. And most of the time they said, I couldn't change the culture, or that wasn't the way that the organization wanted to go, even though strategically the board said this, right? The rest of the population was like, not too sure about fundamentally changing our business model in a year, etc. So that's the kind of things that we talk about. It is a long-term change program that you need to consider. There are metrics and data you can collect to help orient yourself in this new landscape. And then, like any Roman general, you plot where you want to get to. You look at your internal, your external forces, and you start that campaign. But this isn't a one-year training exercise that's going to give you good security culture. And I think the more realistic that InfoSec teams and security awareness teams and CISOs are around this topic, the better their outcomes will be in the long term, because they're not going to fall for the, they're not going to try to figure out that there's a silver bullet that really doesn't exist in terms of changing a culture. This is 20 years of my career, trying to get people to get on the bus. And it's, there are steps you can take to do it positively, and there are lots of things you can do to influence it, but it's not done in a year, especially if you're talking whole scale change.
Maybe a follow-up question for Angelo. Like, would you say that this culture is stemming from, unprepared HR directors wept on the topic of building culture? Would you say that's a potential cause of it?
Oh, I think that has a lot to do with it. I feel, looking back in the last 20 or 25 years that I've been in HR, I always, I feel like the alignment with HR and a cybersecurity internal technology teams, the stronger those relationships are or were, the better it was for everyone. And I use an example when I used to head up corporate human resources at Time Warner. And I felt a lot of what the cybersecurity team tried to do, and we're talking about across all of their pillars in their businesses, we're talking about 90,000 people. Within the corporate Time Warner, under the corporate Time Warner umbrella, they made it fun. And the cybersecurity team had these really cool events where there was an HR element always involved with it. And we did many of the things and rollouts in tandem, and it was a real partnership. But in order for that to happen, number one, there needs to be the relationship. There needs to be the willingness for HR to step in and say, okay, let me learn a little bit more about this. Tech really isn't my thing, or cybersecurity isn't really my thing, but tell me why this is important. But really making it bigger than just that. And I think because we were able to do that effectively, the cybersecurity leadership team that partnered with the HR team made rollouts, implementations, buy-in, culture, all of those things, not only meaningful, but fun. It was fun. I go to these kickoff events and auditoriums. I'm like, why are we here today? I'm like, oh, it's a new cybersecurity thing. This is going to be amazing. And there'd be music involved. It was like, it excited your senses other than just learning about the importance of, like, basically like you're learning through osmosis, right? Like you're seeing what's happening. You see what's happening. You know what's going on. You know why it's important, but you're having a good time while doing it. And you see this alignment internally across your executive team or your portfolio with HR and operations and administration and cybersecurity. And I'm like, that's when it's not only impactful, but it's fun. People want to have fun at work too. I mean, you don't want to sit there and be like, oh, here's another HR lesson. Oh, here's another sexual harassment training I have to sit through. I mean, there are those things that we all have to go through as, good corporate citizens. But I have to say, the most meaningful rollouts I've been involved with have been because of those incredibly strong partnerships between HR, cybersecurity, et cetera. And I feel like that's gold.
It's more than gold, right? That's also the science behind it as well, right? When you think about what you've just described a very powerful and shared experience, right? Where emotions and sort of impacting emotions and changing the state of people's emotions, going from, oh, I'm at work today, oh, what do I have to do, to being like, oh my gosh, this is fun. That change of emotional state in a group setting is a significant shared experience. And so the messaging that can go in during that change of state, while you've got a group of individuals having the same experience, is one of your best mechanisms for actually changing culture and actually changing the dialogue or the behavior around particular issues. It's fantastic. It could work the other way too, right? If everybody's really happy and everything's wonderful, and then something comes in and it's really arresting or scary, or that same sort of sudden change of emotional state, can absolutely work. But obviously at work, we're constantly dealing with pressure, we're constantly dealing with stress. So if you can interject some levity into it and create a shared experience around it, the messages that you sprinkle into that experience will stick, much more likely to stick anyway.
And I think when we look at, just to both of your points, because there's sort of a trend there within business models and how businesses are working now. The hierarchy is falling away. The siloed nature of where we think, Chris, 20 years ago we could just roll out an IT system and that was it. We got to live in our little bucket and that was all we needed to do. But to Angelo's point, when you make it horizontal, when you take the entire company on a journey, when you look at the multiple benefits that exist within a program, But then a rollout of a system, of a process, of a new feature, a new business model, a new line of business, whatever it might be. If you think about that as a change campaign and you say, who are all the different stakeholders involved in this? HR, IT, finance, risk, etc. And then let's get the best of all worlds and let's roll it out together in a team that likes to have some fun. I think that's where the magic happens. That's the secret sauce that makes this stuff not just be like, yeah, that was a great rollout, it was like a rock concert, I loved it, but it's the reducing of friction after that in asking people to adopt. And that's modern business right now. What have we not asked people to adopt in the last 20 years? I mean, look, we just went through the last year, we just had to ask people to adopt remote working like overnight. We asked them to we've adopted all sorts of different behaviors, I think, in the last year. But if you take it the macro view and you look at this from a 30,000 foot perspective, technology change and business transformation and cybersecurity risk explosion and the change of the workforce and demographics and regulatory, you can take all these macro trends and basically the thread underneath them is it's going faster and it's bigger. So the more group wins you can get, the better.
So
that's my soapbox for the day. Sorry, I get very
absolutely true.
So how can cyber professionals best approach work with their HR teams on training issues or any cyber issues, really?
From an HR perspective, it's all in the approach, right? There has to be a relationship. There has to be the time that aligns the two powers. In my opinion, I feel like getting to know your business partners at all levels is critical in all business. But when it comes to functional areas that make decisions that affect entire teams, both technically and culturally, there has to be an alignment. There has to be this simpatico understanding of why they're doing it. But with that, you have to have teams on both sides that are open to feedback. And this might not work, but let me tell you why I'm thinking that. A lot of times I've also been in very rigid environments very early on in my career where, like Kate said, it's like tech is tech and this is what we're doing and we're going to roll this out in your system. Upgrade, you have to log in again on Friday and it's a new system and you just have to deal with it. It was very kind of like being force-fed, kind of the way maybe it used to be. And I think given the state of where we are today, I feel like those relationships have evolved tremendously, at least in my experiences from an HR perspective as it relates to all things cyber. And I feel like when we're brought into it very early on, saying, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing over the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, this is how we're thinking of staging this. What are your feelings here? Will this work? From a timing perspective, how do you think it's going to be received? Are we doing it in a way that resonates with the groups as you know them? There's this dance that's happening, right? Because we want to make sure that it's optimal across the board. And we want to make sure that we're not going to damage one group or alienate one group because we're making decisions without kind of reading all the tea leaves. And I feel like it's delicate. And I feel like there's a lot of sensitivities involved, and the same could be said on the HR side of the house. I don't like personally rolling out any large HR or administrative or operational initiatives without having, shared that messaging with my senior leadership team to say, hey guys, this is what we're thinking of doing. This is what our timing looks like. I would really welcome your feedback on timing, your thoughts. How do you think your team will react to it? It's really having a very thoughtful conversation before we go forward with some sort of major rollout or announcement. It doesn't need to be massive. It's a courtesy. It's an involvement to show your individual and your fellow teammates or managers that their opinion matters in a huge way. And the success of this has as much to do with me rolling it out as it does to them or with them. That I think is at the foundation of all of it. And I feel like a lot of times that's negated because, again, we're moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. We are drinking from the fire hose. We don't have time to handhold. I can't tell you how many times C-level executives have told me, we're not a teaching hospital, figure it out. Like, it literally, and that is the way it is. And I laugh because I'm like, I could certainly fall into that bucket as well. But I really have to stop myself because, again, and it's maybe where I was raised in New York, and it's constant, knowing that that's not the way it is everywhere I work or for the clients I work with, and kind of taking a step back, taking an extra breath, and saying, okay, well, let's do this in a way that I think will have optimal results.
And Angela, to that point, because I wanted to loop Chris in on a conversation that we had a number of times, which is that constant pace, the back and forth, and what we come up against quite a few times is, well, we only have 20 minutes a year per employee of training time to dedicate to cybersecurity. And it's like, you know, how do we start having those conversations saying, well, this is not something that can be time boxed, or this is not something that, you know, can be audited? Because Chris, I know that that's something that we've talked about quite a bit.
Well, it comes, I mean, I just couldn't agree with Angelo more. I think, you know, there's so much there in starting early and starting the conversations early and starting the conversations before you have a need, right? Starting the conversations before you're getting ready to ask, right? I mean, because it's about a relationship, you need to establish that relationship with your HR team, and you need the HR team to establish a relationship with what you're trying to do. If you think about technology and IT, and some of the most esoteric, complicated stuff about IT is the cybersecurity elements. If you want to think about, again, some of the more ethereal, mutable, random stuff that goes on, well, it's probably coming out of your people, right? So you take these two worlds that are incredibly nuanced and incredibly complicated for very, very different reasons. A highly technical arena versus a highly mutable, sort of emotionally based arena. And you're going to try to do something that fuses both of these arenas together. Well, there's no way you're going to come up, I think, with an optimal solution or approach unless you get experts from both of those fields to understand one another. But don't underestimate the size of that gap. The size of that gap is really, really big. So how do you deal with that? Yeah, you make the commitment to develop the relationship, and you make that commitment very, very early, and you know, see where it goes before you have the need, right? Because I agree. I mean, half the half the friction that I've seen in days past is like, yeah, you're focused on your metrics, and you have to deliver this cybersecurity training or whatever it is. And so you're building out all of the different, you know, things that you've got to build out, making sure you're covering the right systems, and, you know, you get all this stuff sorted out, and then you're like, oh yeah, we got to go talk to HR because, you know, we need permission to do it, right? And that you know, you've missed it, right? Because already you feel like you're late, and HR is going to slow you down, and the relationship's adversarial from the get-go. So
but in a way, shouldn't cybersecurity know, sort of like, shouldn't you know the feeling? Because isn't that the conversation that cybersecurity has with software development all the time, which is like, if you guys had asked us to sit at the table during the requirements engineering when we had first looked at system design, you might not have backed yourself into this corner. We wouldn't have to be re-architecting the whole thing to be secure right now.
Yeah, so my advice to CISOs would be social engineer HR, right? Like, go start early, build up the trust, right? Get escalating credential access, right? All of that stuff. Yeah, but it takes time. Yeah.
It absolutely does. But again, you can't underplay the importance of building that relationship. No one wants to walk into something saying, oh, this is what we're doing, this is why, without having that conversation as to this is why we think it will work and how you could help us make this be successful. We want to be included in those decisions. As busy as everyone is, it's like, I want to be part of it. Tell me why you're doing it, because I want to be able to sell this to my people, to be like, hey guys, this is what's coming up. It's huge. It's so good for us. Let me tell you why. Because you kind of want HR to be your hype man too, right? It's like there's the human element of what human resources does that kind of get people on board with whatever it is we're trying to sell. And if it's something that we know is going to be a Herculean effort, you know, then you know what? The earlier the involvement, the better. The more positive press or spin we put around things, if we know it's a heavy lift, the better it's going to be for everyone.
Great. And cyber and IT have gone through massive shifts in the past 5 years. What about HR? You know, what happened in a function we don't always get to dig into on a cyber podcast, unless it's about the massive need for people to come and join us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think this is very interesting because if this last year is a litmus test, I mean, I've had more conversations with technology and cybersecurity folks than I've had ever in my career because of the necessity of what it is. We have a remote workforce. We have people taking computers home. Where are we from? Number one, just an equipment standpoint, who has what? How is that being tracked? Do they have secure networks at home? How is this happening? We have to do all these calls now on Zoom. Like, people were being thrust into an environment of everyone's working from home. This isn't a negotiation. Like, our offices are closed. You need to be set up at home properly. Do you have what you need? If not, how do we get you what you need? People are like, we need printers, we need this, we need equipment, we need a new laptop, I need a router. My Wi-Fi is slow. How do we upgrade that? And it literally was like this insane partnership between all things technology and cybersecurity and HR. And it was kind of nice because it exposed me to areas that I never really had to be exposed to, just because, this is not any of us have worked through pandemic or lived through pandemic before. So I feel like it was huge learning. But I think because of that, it really strengthened, at least from my perspective, the relationships to, number one, loop HR in more heavily to what was happening, to help kind of track what was happening, to be, when the cybersecurity teams are coming to me saying, what do you think we need? They're at home, but these are the things we're thinking are priority. What are you thinking? And they could be completely different. I'm like, ergonomics, do they have a desk chair? Do they have this? Like, looking at it from that perspective, and they're like, okay, well, what does their wireless system look like? And if we wanted to upgrade them, how do we do that? And do we pay for it? And what does that look like? And we put together a budget on that. It was a lot of moving pieces. And again, it was a little bit like, we were building the plane as we were flying it, because we never lived through any of this nonsense before. We had no idea what to do or how long it was going to last. Oh, we only need that set up for a couple of weeks. We'll be back to the office. Then that turned into a month, and then 3 months, and then 6 months, and a year, and then a year plus in. We're like, okay, how do we reacclimate back in now? So that's a whole other conversation. But I feel like it was a very interesting time for, I feel, HR professionals and cybersecurity professionals to really show their alignment and partnership to get through this. And so the employees didn't feel as if, listen, their hair was already on fire. They were like, the world is exploding. What the hell are we going to do? We need people to be a sense of calm. And I think the good cyber teams and HR teams that came together to kind of soothe that out a little bit, I think were hugely successful in an environment that I didn't think was going to be manageable.
There was a precursor to that cooperation as well, right? The whole GDPR implementation in Europe in particular, and then all the kerfuffle, I think, around the problems that Facebook had, and really started to bring that issue of data and data privacy to the fore. And in particular, where were a lot of the risks? Well, a lot of the risks were around HR teams and how they were managing data in their systems. And I think those exercises, as painful as they were, there was a huge step forward in terms of beginning to help HR professionals get a snapshot into some of the risks that were being managed on the IT side. And similarly, a real healthy view, I think, on the IT and the cybersecurity side in terms of the types of issues that HR have to grapple with, whether it's mental health issues or whether it's family issues, and that idea of sensitive data, I think, started a cooperation there. It was the first time, at least in my career, where HR teams were like, okay, we have to own this data. How do we protect our data? And then coming to the IT teams in a consultative fashion to start to figure out how are we going to do this. And I thought that was, again, as painful as it was sort of a watershed moment as far as I can see.
Agreed.
So any additional comments, Kate, or?
Oh God, I could,
Oh man.
Oh
yeah, we don't have another hour, right? Yeah.
No, I think that's it. And I my bugaboo in kind of that regard is just that a lot of times HR, I think, is a underfunded experience at a large organization. And, that lack of resources has meant over time, there are some cultural things that, HR teams have had to deal with. And so when you come to them with new ideas and you come to them with new technology, you come to them, they're like, we just barely got it together. Stop moving my cheese. And I think that cyber especially, there's so many things going on. And for instance, just cyber awareness is changing so fast. What the metrics we're looking at, how we're helping people with change, the tools that are available to measure this. What do all these different technologies mean together? How do we actually influence the culture? And those conversations can't just happen, within the cybersecurity awareness zone or in the cyber team in of themselves. So those are the kind of things that I think, as Chris said, building up those relationships and kind of having a sit down before you need to have the sit down, and just being able to hear their story and what HR has gone through. I mean, from a non-technical people having to absorb rapid technology change. If you look at even, Angela, how HRIS systems have moved to the cloud and how they've integrated different parts of workforce management and how recruiting has changed and how we do this stuff at volume, it is really an interesting thing. We look at the customer data, we look at the credit card data, we look at the data that, is the crown jewels of our business that we need to keep behind a moat or something. I don't know. It got very video gamey for a few years there. But what the opposite side of that is, who are the people actually dealing with that technology change, and are you allowing them to be cyber secure with these systems? And I think that's the conversation that is a great icebreaker, just going into HR and being like, hey, how you guys doing? Like, before we even go to L&D, before we go to rolling out training to all the employees, before we go to this, what can we solve for you? Because you guys have had to deal with XYZ change in the last 5 years. Maybe it's how do we shore up that side of the business, and then let's talk about an approach to get everybody else on the bus.
Well, I think this last year plus has been the great equalizer, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to all of the alignments, and I was thinking about this earlier. I was having a conversation with a recruiter. I'm like, they didn't teach me in college, how to recruit remotely completely, and how do we do that? And how do we do things when it's only on video? We're not meeting them in person. And how do, there was all of these learnings this year, I think, for everyone. Certainly from an HR perspective, I mean, I felt it. And growing up and having an understanding for what my function is and how much of that involves in-person contact and touch, and and all of a sudden for that to completely go away when that's been my model for 20 years, I'm like, I does not compute. I don't know what to do. Where do I start? And it was like literally a complete reset to how the heck do we do this? And it had to be the same from a tech perspective when everyone all of a sudden was remote, and the needs have changed literally overnight. And it was a moment of, you need to get it done. You need to get it done quickly because business can't skip a beat. So how the hell are we doing this together? I don't know. I thought it was an incredible year for us to really come together as partners and figure things out in a way that probably we hadn't done in the past because we hadn't had the need to.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to kind of sum up the panel. And I guess, how has this changed cybersecurity and HR, and what are we doing? What are you doing to address the remote worker?
Again, I think
we're leaving them to drown. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. As Chris mentioned, it's a living and breathing thing. I mean, every day it's different. Every day it's evolving and changing. There's no there is a right answer for this moment, but that's going to change in 20 minutes. So I feel like this is really where we're at, and I think a lot of it has to, the words I continue to use are pivot, flexibility, like all these words that annoy me when I think about them, but they are absolutely not, they're essential, because we are at the mercy of any given piece of data that any piece of data we're given at any moment based on some new rule or guideline or law or whatever the case might be. So I feel like the fundamental message for me here, and the takeaway is, as long as we are staying connected through a pandemic and beyond, as it relates to all things cybersecurity and HR and any initiatives that we need to partner up on. I think in large part, the relationship has been strengthened. And I feel like it's going to help us get what we need to get done, no matter what the approach is, because we've kind of built this or reinforced this trust and this alignment that, again, I feel like hadn't existed previously. Just overarching, that's where my head's at on this.
And I think in a really interesting way, I think that the whole home working and the change overnight, again, forced more of a consideration of the humanity and the uniqueness of individuals on the cybersecurity teams, because effectively, again, you're now starting to think about, well, not how can I create a cybersecurity policy that ultimately covers off, the entire organization, and gosh, do I have to come up with, separate policies to cover off different divisions because they're actually dealing with different. No, you got to deal with stuff that's happening literally for individuals who each have a different home setup, who each are involved in a different sort of risk profile in terms of the types of activities that they have to go through because it's their home setup, right? And you can't control that infrastructure to the nth degree. So I think in some ways it helped distill the thinking around cybersecurity in terms of focusing on again those types of solutions that could be deployed, again, working from anywhere. But at the same time, I think it really brought home, for me anyway, it brought home the fact that individuals are reacting in a very different way based on where they're coming from and what's happening at home, and they have very different circumstances now, and they have less of a shared experience in the office place. They're having much more of a unique experience. So how do you try to drive behavior change in that instance, and then how do you keep people safe, and how do you prioritize? And but I completely agree, Angelo. It's just the flexibility that's required, the the understanding and the kindness that's really required, I think, in your thought process as you start to think about, okay, well, what's the real objective here, right? And how do we balance competing objectives?
I think one of the things, Chris, that you and I had talked about way back in 2019,
make my head hurt.
Woof, is we come up with that term that I love using, which is you have to get your workforce to become continually adapting cyber defense agents. And it was a little bit wordy, so I was like, I don't know, can we copyright that? I don't know. But it's the challenge really is around the mindset. And so when we flipped this from is it a tick box exercise, or is it something that's more, when you start looking at security and safety and risk as a human factor, as a benefit to your organization or as a risk to your organization, I mean, especially at IRONSCALES, all the stats around how spear phishing works and how, clicking works and why people click and how these things happen. But the thing is that if you develop that security aware culture, if you develop a culture that cares about security, because I don't think awareness is the end goal. I think awareness is step one. And then we need to get them to care. And then we need to get them to care so much they will do something about it. It's an action-oriented culture. But the mindset there in the beginning is very different. So if you had that culture and that mindset, and then you had a huge business change, like what we just went through over the last year, and you were prepared for it in a way, then your people can be more flexible because they know they have to adapt to this. Mm-hmm. Versus, taking a more static approach, once a year training, one size fits all, just a tick box exercise. You're not helping them react in the right way. Mm-hmm. The thing we know this is going to be true, right? We know that every day the hackers are one step ahead of us, and they're going to present our employees with impossible choices. They're going to try to scam them and con them and trick them and psychologically destroy them. And it's not one type of example. It's not one type of email that's happening. It's not one type of threat that's happening. It's in person, it's on the phone, it's everywhere, right? So the human adaptation that we actually need is, the first thing is we need them to accept that they can change. We need them to accept this change and then realize that this is going to be a continual learning process for them for the rest of their lives. And I think back to the kindness, Chris, we have to present that story with kindness, because it's a lot to swallow for any normal person. It's like, I don't know if I signed up for this digital future that we're all like, you know, a Brave New World, Ready Player One. I don't know if I just, you know, I'm into a Tron. I don't want to go Tron, full Tron. But at the same point, all of my services are now online, and after 2020, even more so. So that flexibility, that agility at the organizational level comes from the people's ability to do it, and you have to support them psychologically so that they can make these changes. And that's all the hand in hand with cyber and culture and HR and learning, and packaged together in a happy in a happy kind of way. But that's, I think, what last year proved to us, is the companies that weren't able to do that at scale and at speed, right? Hopefully you're now realizing that those are the fundamental capabilities they need to put into place in terms of HR and their security culture, their security behaviors, and how they motivate them at an organization.
A great summary and great way to end this fascinating topic.
Listening to all of you.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope the audience will be able to take something away, and looking forward to touching on this topic again in the future. Anyone would like to get in touch with any of you, what's the best way? I can start with you, Kate.
Oh, sure. So you can find us at the Cybermaniacs. We're the cybermaniacs.com, or we have a pretty good Twitter feed or a LinkedIn game going on. So feel free to reach out through any of those channels. We'd love to chat.
And I guess the same for you, Angelo and Chris, or if you want to, if any.
Yeah, Chris at the cybermaniacs.com. Yeah, but just head on to the Cybermaniacs site, check it out, and we're all accessible through there for sure.
Ditto.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Cybersecurity Heroes, and to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.